Alright, it's time to take a look at our model as far as putting a few refinements into it and starting to pay a little bit of attention to materials and lighting in Blender. So let's start off by looking at our model from a front orthographic viewpoint. So I'm going to tap 1 on the number pad. Oops, got to give focus to Blender. Tap 1 on the number pad. And my front orthographic viewport is in front of me, so I'm going to tap Z to get a wireframe view so I can kind of look through things. And obviously this model, basically it's all roughed in, but there are a few areas where it's a little bit lacking. The arms, for instance, are very... Whoops, let's select that so we can rotate around it. The arms are very, very blocky. Basically, if you tab into edit mode and look at these, the sides of them here are completely flat, and that's really not what we need. We need them to be rounded, a little more like they are in an actual Lego toy. If you look at the head, it's a little bit, well, it's probably actually pretty close to where we need it to be. Everything else, things are starting to look pretty good. Some of these items look a little strange when they're smooth shaded, but they also look a little bit strange when they're flat shaded. They look a little too geometric this way, and maybe a little too marshmallowy this way. So let's go back to flat shading on those. And we'll start to deal with that in a few minutes, just what we can do to sort of tighten things up there. So first of all, let's deal with the arms. The arms are a little bit blocky, so we need to round them out. Blender has a feature which is really handy called a modifier stack, and it allows you to apply non-destructive modifiers to your model. So that's over here with this little wrench icon. This is how you access the modifier stack. We've already seen it a little bit because we have applied a mirror modifier, so we only had to model one arm here. And that's been pretty handy. Another modifier, what could end up being one of your best friends when using Blender, is the subdivision surface modifier. Let's add that to the arms and see if we can kind of see what it does. So if we click on that, you can see that things rounded out and smoothed out very dramatically. Over here under our options, you can see it's set to render subdivisions, basically a multiplier of 2 as far as the subdivisions goes, but we're only looking at 1 in the view. Now, because I'm on a relatively fast computer here, I'm going to up my view to 2 so I can kind of see what I'm working at as far as subdivisions go when I'm going to be rendering. So basically I want my preview to look like my render will look as far as smoothness. So I'm going to put that up there. If I tab into edit mode, you can still see that I haven't actually changed the blockiness of the arms, but they are showing up differently. The edit cage here looks different than the actual displayed mesh. And basically what the subdivision surface modifier does is it looks at adjacent vertices. So this is going to be a little difficult to see for a second. Let's turn it off. This little eyeball here will allow us to turn it off. So if I'm going to isolate the arms here by hitting the / key on the number pad, then tab into edit mode, and you can see we have a vertex here, and a vertex here, and a vertex here. I'm starting to sound like Old MacDonald. So these vertices make almost a 90-degree turn right here and down here. They're very, very sharp angles. If I turn our subdivision surface modifier back on, you can see that basically what the Subsurf modifier does is it goes from one vertex and it comes down and it kind of curves to just sort of make a snake-like averaging of the path between the vertices. So that's what the Subsurf modifier does for us. And that smooths things out really, really nicely Let's see, I'm going to unhide the rest of my geometry here. It smooths things out maybe a little too well, because now this is looking a lot less like we need it to look. It's looking more like a marshmallow than a piece of molded plastic. So knowing what the Subsurf modifier does, we can manipulate that by adding a little bit of geometry in here. Let's tab into edit mode to basically describe a little more closely what we want happening. So if I do a loop cut, Control R, and I come and make a loop cut and then slide it down to the very edge of this former edge here, you can see that things sharpened up a little bit there. Let's do another loop cut down along the wrist here and bring it up, and you can really see things sharpening up there. So if I tab out of edit mode, you can see that we have a much sharper transition between the sleeve and the wrist now. So let's sharpen up a few more details in here. Let's make the transition between the wrist and the hand a little more sharp. And the edge of this hand, this kind of slopes down in a really gradual way, and I want that to be a little sharper. So another loop cut here. Just bring that all the way forward, maybe not quite touching its nearest neighbor. And that actually looks a lot more like we'd want our Lego arm to look. That's actually not bad. One more adjustment you can make with the subdivision surface modifier is you can, right here, let me close down and collapse that mirror modifier so it doesn't confuse us. You can hit this little button here to adjust the edit cage to modify a result. What that means basically is, instead of seeing where our vertices and our faces and our edges actually are, it will show us where the subdivision surface modifier is going to display them. So if I click here, you can see that I get a little better idea of what the geometry is going to look like, as opposed to just what it's doing. Let's sharpen up this back edge here as well. Control R, and that'll just give us another. There we go. So those arms are a lot better now than they were. I'm actually a lot happier with the way that's looking. So we could probably sharpen up the head just a little bit using this same technique. So let's add a subdivision surface modifier to the head. You can see that it's given us a very gradual kind of curving path between vertices that were previously showing very sharp edges. Okay, if I go into wireframe mode, you can see that things are still looking very sharp there. So let's edit this one with the edit cage adjusted for the Subsurf modifier. We can see a little better what it's doing here. So obviously up at the top here, I don't want this gradual transition into the head button. So I'm going to do a loop cut and slide, Control R, and just slide that down like that. Okay, and Control R up here, that gives us something that's a lot closer to what we tried to describe in the first place with our geometry. Down here, this is obviously curving where it shouldn't. Control R gives us a little more control of that. Control R. Okay, and that's looking more like it should have looked in the first place. Let's go into wireframe mode and have a look at the inside. You can see that the cavity that we put inside of this is also curving in a way that it shouldn't. So from our wireframe view, we can actually put a subdivision or a loop cut and slide inside here. We can make the top of that square again, and this is sloping out to the sides here in a way that it shouldn't. So let's just give that a little more geometry to describe it. And that is a much better representation of the head. Now, you might notice that if we zoom in here, you can see it's subtle, but because we have triangles up here instead of quads, and because of the arrangement of them, the top of this button head looks a little bit funny. it kind of has shadows fanning out from it. Let's tab into edit mode and you'll be able to see kind of why that is. I'm going to turn off our edit cage adjustment. You can kind of see what's going on here. These fans are all, there's a lot of detail in here, and so the Subsurf modifier is picking up on that and saying, well, I think we need to do something to describe the detail, and its best guess seems to be those shadows. So we need to actually change the top of this, how it's made, to better accommodate a subdivision surface modifier, and this is going to be a little bit weird. Let's delete this vertex, and that will leave us kind of a gaping hole up here. I'm going to tap 7 to go to our top view, and if I select half of the total vertices in this thing, I know there are 32, so I'm selecting half on each side, which actually isn't 8, it's 9 because of the way things line up. So basically you do select the edges. Alright, my shortcut here is Control F. Whoops, missed. Control F. And I have an option here called Grid Fill. And the way this works is kind of funny, but rather than try to describe it, I'll just show you. If I hit Grid Fill, then you can see that looks like it's going to be bulging out toward the camera here, but in fact it's not. It's perfectly flat on top. That hasn't quite fixed our problem, but that will come pretty close. So if we adjust our edit cage again, you can see that these corners are actually a little bit funny. They branch out in a way that they shouldn't. So I'm going to add one more piece of geometry here. Control R to give myself a loop cut, and I'm going to move that all the way up as far as I can. Then I'm going to come on top here and select my different edges. So Option click, Option Shift click to get all those edges. I want everything selected in here. Whoops. So I'm going to tap C on my keyboard to give myself a circle selection brush and just paint everything in here. I accidentally selected a couple of vertices over here that I shouldn't, but that's what I want. And now I will just scale that whole top down to kind of recurve the top. And now you can see that takes care of the weirdness on top. So a little bit of a trick when dealing with subdivision surface modifiers and cylinder end caps. They get a little bit funny when they try to work together. Okay, one more thing I'm going to do. We flat shaded the legs down here, so I'm going to select them. Now I've shown you previously how you can change the smooth or shading mode here from smooth to flat and back again under the tools menu. What I haven't shown you is that you can actually do this selectively for individual faces. So I'm going to tap 1 on the number pad to go to a straight front view, tab into edit mode, then go to face select mode, tap Z to get a wireframe view, and then I'm just going to once again use my circle select tool here. Come around the back, and that looks like I've got everything selected that I want. And if I go to shading / UVs, you can see that I have options for the faces, the edges, and the vertices. So I'm going to tell it to smooth shade just those faces. And that will create a much more pleasing result, because I don't want these hard edges to look marshmallowy. I don't want them to kind of bulge out the way they were. We can do the same thing to the pelvis piece here. Tab into edit mode, and select just the faces that we want to be smooth shaded, and tell them to be smooth shaded. Okay, so they actually already were. If I want to select the exact opposite faces of what I currently have selected, there's actually a keyboard shortcut for that, and it is Control-Shift-I. Sorry, Control-I. So if I tap Control-I, then I've now selected all of the faces that I did not have selected that are part of this one object before, and I can tell these pieces to be flat shaded. Okay, so now I've got smooth shading on the edges of the cylinder there and flat shading on the rest of it, and that will probably produce a much more pleasant result. Alright, so if we look through our camera object now, which is right here, tap 0 on the number pad, we can look through that. We can manipulate this camera object just like any other object. We can tap G to grab it and move it around. We can tap R to rotate it. And obviously, in this particular view and at this angle, that can be a little bit weird. So what I like to do sometimes is split my view out. Tap N and T to get rid of these side views here, and then just tap 7 on my numpad to go into a top-down view of this. And let's open this up. We can now kind of move things around as far as defining how far away our camera should be. We can get a pretty good idea of where it should be. The other thing you can do is over here, while looking through your camera, you can hit Shift F, and that will allow you to move around using the mouse and the WASD keys. So W moves you forward, S moves you backward, A and D move you from side to side. So in combination with the mouse, that can be a really good organic way to kind of move your mouse into position. Okay, so I'm going to close this window down, and at this point, if we were to come over here to our Render tab, hit Render, then you can see that things are looking pretty smooth. It looks pretty good. I still have a cylinder. If I hit Escape to go out of my render view, I don't see it there, but obviously it is there, and I'm remembering now I hid that from view when I was working on this before. So Option or Alt H, I can grab that cylinder and delete it. The other thing I'm going to do, I have a lot of things here that were made out of cylinders, so I'm going to name my objects really quick. Let's click on the head and come over here to the object data. I can see that it's currently called cylinder.004. Let's call it Lego head. I'll grab the torso. It's already called Lego torso. We named that previously. Let's name the arms here Lego arms. Lego pelvis, Lego legs. Okay, and that will kind of help to put things together and keep track of things. If I want to select something over here in the outliner, I can do so just by clicking on it. Now I have a much better idea of what I'm selecting. Okay, so one weird thing that we had going on there is the light source when we render is behind our Lego man, and that's a little strange. So let's go into a top view, and you can kind of see the position of the light source there. Let's just grab that and move it over here. Okay, and again, our camera's over here, so it's not directly behind the camera or in front of it. And now, let's try rendering. That looks a little better. I think that's kind of a cooler view. Okay, let's hit Escape. Now, that is an example of what Blender Render can do. In our class, we're going to use the Cycles renderer because it's an unbiased renderer and much more powerful and more accurate than the Blender renderer. So up here at the top of your screen, you can switch over to Cycles Render, and that will influence how we make our materials. So let's start doing that. Let's make some materials here. So if I click on the head of my Lego man here, go over to the Materials tab, you can see that this object contains no material slots. And it can contain multiples, or it can contain just a single slot. So I'm going to hit the plus sign here to add a new material slot. It's currently empty, So let's click on New to make a new material. It's called material.001, which isn't very descriptive. I'm going to call this yellow plastic. That way I'll be able to tell kind of what I'm looking at a little better. And diffuse, basically, diffuse in terms of a shader or a material means this is going to be the color of the object, essentially. So if I click on that diffuse shader and just turn it kind of a nice Lego-y yellow, and you might not see any change here, but when I render this object, you can see it's rendering a little differently because we're in cycles now, and the head is in fact yellow. That's not a very realistic plastic. It doesn't have any specular highlights. So let's change that around here a little bit. Let's go escape out of our render and go back to our materials tab. Now instead of just diffuse, I need some more attributes. I need basically some more shaders. I need more than a color. I need glossiness. So I have a glossy shader here, but in order to bring that to bear, I would have to replace the diffuse shader, and that's not really going to work. So what I actually need here is I need a mix shader. And I can now mix two shaders. I can mix a diffuse and I can mix a glossy shader. So for the diffuse, I can pick my yellow color again. And let's open the preview so we can kind of see what this is going to look like. I can control the mix factor right here, and that looks like too much glossy, not enough yellow to me. So I'm going to pull that over in favor of the glossy shader, and that looks fairly plasticky, but to me it doesn't look shiny enough. Part of the reason for that is because of this roughness value right here. This is not very rough. So if I pull that down, you can see that things are getting a lot smoother looking, which makes sense. That's the roughness value. So that's actually a pretty good plastic. What would it look like now if we were to render this Lego man? Not much different, but you can see now that there are some specular highlights visible here. And the reason it's not much different so far is that our light source is not doing very much for us in terms of lighting up our scene. So one of the neat things you can also do in the Cycles renderer is you can, instead of just a wireframe or a flat shaded viewport, you can actually go to a rendered viewport. And that will allow you, since I have the lamp selected here, that will allow you to go in. I can click Use Nodes. That's basically Blenderese for I want to use the Cycles renderer or the Cycles abilities with this particular object or material or whatever it is. And I can come here to the strength of this and I can dial that way up. Let's try 600 for instance. You can see that that made a really immediate difference, and this is looking very plasticky, so I'm pretty happy with that. Now let's go back to the different parts. I think I'm going to leave the head alone from here. Let's go back to our different parts of the Lego man. Let's go to the arms, for instance, and go back to the Materials tab. And if you can see the arms don't have any material slots. So if I add a material slot here, I can then actually just put my yellow plastic material in there, and they immediately become yellow plastic, which isn't really what I want. I don't want the arms to look like their skin, like this guy is wearing a vest or something. So I am going to hit this little button right here. That will create a new copy of this yellow plastic material. So right now, if I modify this material, it will also modify the head. So I want to make a new copy of this material that's just for the arms. So I hit this little plus button, and you can see that now I'm no longer working with the material called yellow plastic. I'm working with a material called yellowplastic.001. So I'm going to rename that, and I'm going to call this blue plastic. And obviously it's really poorly named right now, but I can click on my color down here and change that to a nice kind of deep blue. Let's make it a little lighter. And that changes the arms but not the head. Okay. So let's make some quick plastic materials for the other parts of the body. I think I will change. Oh, look, there's already a material assigned to the torso. That's kind of strange. So I need to change this to a cycles material by clicking Use Nodes. And let's change that. Actually, let's put that yellow plastic on and make a new copy, and we'll call this one green plastic. I think that would be a good color for the torso there. So let's change that to green. We're kind of dealing with primary colors here, I guess. Red, yellow, and green. And I'm going to come down here to the pelvis and change that to blue. And I think I'll make a new color for the legs out of the yellow color. So let's hit the plus sign and call this red plastic. And change it to a nice bright primary red. There we go. So our Lego man's colored pretty well there. And he's actually starting to look kind of cool. It doesn't really look very convincing though, in that he doesn't have anything to stand on. So I can actually go over to my create menu here. He's not casting a shadow or anything right now. I'm just going to add a plane here, and I'm going to change the radius of that plane to something really, really large. And obviously he's standing in the middle of it, so I'm going to grab it in the Z-axis and bring it down. Let's go into our wireframe mode, and we can make sure that this Z-axis, or that this is standing right on top of that plane there. And then go back to our rendered viewport, and that looks a little more realistic. You can see now that the plastic here is starting to pick up hints of reflections from the floor, which is kind of cool. And that's one thing that an unbiased renderer does for you. There's one kind of last materials problem here with the Lego man, and that's that his hands are blue and they should be yellow. So let's have a look at that. Let's go back to our flat shaded viewport and tab into edit mode on these hands. So I can see, yep, the material slot for these just has blue plastic. I mentioned earlier you can assign more than one material to an object. So let's go to our front orthographic view and just kind of start selecting as much of these hands as we can. And we are going to assign a material just to the faces that we want to turn yellow. So we'll select those faces, there we've got them. And we will add a second material slot and change that to the yellow plastic material. And if we go to our material viewport, you can see that hasn't done anything. They're still blue. While we have these faces selected, we have to come over here and hit assign. We have to select the yellow plastic material and hit assign, and then that will fix the problem for us. Let's tab back out of edit mode and go to our rendered view, and you can see that that looks pretty good. I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to brighten up my lamp here. I still don't think it's quite bright enough. Let's go to 1600. And that looks pretty bright. That looks like kind of a fun, very colorful image of a Lego minifigure. So, made a little progress here. I hope this helps, and I'll see you in class.